Welcome back, everybody, to another reaction video. Well, one of the most popular videos that I have reacted to thus far, at least in terms of the views that my reaction has gotten, has been Neil Halloran's visualization of the fallen of World War II. Continues to get a lot of views. It's obviously a topic that a lot of people have interest in. So I wanted to find something comparable about World War I because I've been doing a lot of study on World War I as of late. It seems to be one of my areas of great interest. But Neil Halloran didn't make a comparable video for that. But inspired by that, there's another channel that did. And so I've decided to take a look at real life lore and their visualization of the loss of life in World War I. I'll put a link in the description below to their original content, so you can go check them out, give them a like, leave a comment on the original video, and check it out for yourself. But I wanted to dive into this one today. And you're going to probably see a lot more World War I content from me in the months ahead, just because it is a topic that I've got so much interest in, as well as I'm hoping that once COVID clears up, that sometime maybe later this year or early next year, I'll be making a trip to the World War I battlefields of the Western Front in Europe. So, with that in mind, let's go ahead and dive into this. Please don't forget to subscribe, to like. If you want to support my fundraising venture for that trip to Europe to visit the World War I battlefields, as well as World War II battlefields, as well as Waterloo, all of that is going to be included in one big long trip going to France, Germany, Netherlands, Belgium. There's a link in the description to the GoFundMe that was set up by our mods to raise money for that. So thank you in advance for that. Let's dive into real life lore's World War I loss of life visualized.
This video is made possible by Skillshare. Learn anything you want to learn with Skillshare for free for 2 months at skl.sh/reallifelore18. I purposefully released this video on the 9th of November 2018. 2 days from now, on the 11th of November, will mark exactly 100 years since the end of the First World War, one of the most destructive and violent wars ever fought in human history. While the Second World War and the destruction it caused often overshadow the First World War, I felt like now would be a good time to remember and visualize the enormous loss of life that the Great War caused. We'll be counting soldiers and civilians separately, as well as deaths and injuries separately. A casualty can be a confusing statistic in war because it means that a soldier has been taken out of action, but not necessarily killed.
So yeah, he makes a really good point there, because one person could actually count for multiple casualties, because you could be wounded 4 different times and then killed, and that would be 5 casualties. So it gets a little bit misleading. So honestly, the death casualty is much easier to compare, just because deaths are final and nobody can die more than once. But it's a good point. The other thing I would say about World War I that makes it different than World War II is, while World War II may have had more deaths, remember that there were more people on the planet during World War II, but also the deaths in World War I were much more confined, mostly to the battlefields of Europe. Whereas World War II had the Pacific, there were millions of deaths in China, so it was much more spread out. Whereas World War I, we're talking about very confined spaces in France and the eastern part of Germany and then Western Russia. So you have much smaller areas where huge casualties happen. Verdun, for example, you got a couple square miles where hundreds of thousands of people died. It's just ridiculous to even comprehend.
Each of these models represents 1,000 people who died or went missing, while each of these models represents 1,000 people who were injured, which when combined equal the number of casualties. And we'll begin the counting with the United States. Over 116,000 soldiers died, and another 204,000 were injured fighting against the Germans and Austrians on the Western Front. This amounted to 0.17% of the American population at the time.
So we'll say this about the U.S. You know, U.S. was only really in combat. I mean, we declared war in April of 1917, but we were really only heavily involved in combat in September and October of 1918. There was some fighting in June with the Marines at Belleau Wood, for example, but the vast majority of the U.S. casualties happened in about a 6-week period right at the end of the war. Meuse-Argonne Front, Saint-Mihiel salient. So about 53,000 or so combat deaths. The other half of the deaths were from disease. So it's very, very insignificant when compared to other countries. But when you figure how short a time it took place during, it was actually pretty heavy.
The time becoming a casualty of war, but America only fought for a little over a year between 1917 and 1918.
Really didn't even
The war
fight
had
that
already
long.
been going on for over 2.5 years before that. So let's take a look at some of the countries who were fighting from the beginning. The war began when Austria-Hungary declared war against Serbia in 1914, and Serbia suffered worse than any other country during the war. 375,000 Serb soldiers lost their lives in the fighting, while another 625,000 civilians died from famine and disease.
Think about that. 1 million Serbs. This is a tiny, tiny country. And 2/3 of their deaths were civilians. And civilian deaths were massive all throughout. Famine, disease, things like that. I mean, we underestimate just how much that was going on.
That amounted to over 22% of the Serbian population dying during the 4-year-long war.
Just to put that in perspective for my fellow Americans, we have, 330 million people. So think about 22% of our population dying. That's, 60, 70 million people? I mean, that's the level of death that Serbia experienced. Oh my gosh, I just can't imagine.
More than 1 out of every 5 people in the country. Serbia was a member of one of the 2 alliances that fought against one another in the war called the Entente, which also included the United Kingdom, France, Russia, Italy, America, and many others, all of whom would suffer terribly. The United Kingdom would send over 815,000 soldiers to their graves, like on the first day of the Battle of the Somme, in which 19,000 would die in only 24 hours, the bloodiest single day in British history.
And the sad part was with the Somme that the enemy casualties, the German casualties there, were like 1/10 of that. I don't remember exactly what they were, but they were far, far less than what the British suffered on that first day at the Somme. It's just, it's very difficult to wrap your mind around the carnage in small areas in some of these battles. But my goodness, 800,000 dead for the British fighting on French soil. Of course, that's nothing compared to what the French and the Russians lost.
Over 123,000 British civilians also lost their lives during the war, totaling up to just over 2% of the British population, or about 1 in every 50 people dying. But many more were wounded. 1,675,000 more soldiers, which adds together to 5.77% of the UK population then, becoming casualties of the war. Subjects of the British Empire like Australia, Canada, New Zealand, India, and South Africa also fought in the war and took high casualties. Percentage-wise, New Zealand suffered the worst, losing 3.8% of her population as wartime casualties, while numbers-wise Australia took the hardest hit, losing over 61,000 of her soldiers and suffering another 152,000 wounded, with Canada and India both not too far behind. But the other major Entente powers lost an incredible amount more. The Italians joined the war in 1915, but in 3 years of fighting suffered 555,000 military fatalities.
Wow. I'll be honest. I mean, I knew Italy was involved, from near the start of the war. Italy started kind of nominally part of the war, but really was kind of, as I've mentioned before, kind of a free agent and could have gone either way. Kind of like they did in World War II. They kind of ended up fighting for both sides. But boy, over 500,000 Italian dead. That's not something, at least that I can remember hearing much about. You don't really think about the Italians as being involved in any of these great battles. They weren't involved in anything that you talk about, like you talk about the Somme or you talk about Verdun. But yeah, I mean, massive casualties.
Along with 592,000 civilian deaths, another 947,000 Italian soldiers became wounded, representing 5.8% of the Italian population becoming casualties. A figure roughly comparable to the UK percentage. But then there's Russia and France, both of whom suffered higher casualties than the entire Serbian population combined during the war. Russia was the first country to come to Serbia's defense during the war and suffered catastrophic losses. 1,977,000 soldiers died fighting against the Central Powers, while another 1,140,000 civilians lost their lives.
Think about what Russia went through in a period of a couple of generations. Between World War I, between World War II, everything that happened in between, with the millions of deaths from famines and different things like that. I mean, there were entire generations just lost completely. We're so spoiled here in the United States as far as, even what we suffered in World War II. We lost 400,000 dead in World War II. I'm not making light of that. That's 400,000 families whose lives were changed forever. But these countries just were devastated catastrophically for entire generations by these wars. Not only military dead, but civilian dead. I mean, it completely changed those places.
But Russia suffered vastly higher injuries. 4,350,000 soldiers were wounded during the fighting, which together represents 2.5% of the Russian population that became casualties. These enormous losses eventually helped contribute to Russia's spiral into revolution and their surrender in the war early into 1917. But percentage-wise, the Allied country that suffered during the war the most, besides Serbia, was France.
Yeah.
Most of the Western Front took place in northeastern France and Belgium, and during 4 years of fighting, 1,377,000 French soldiers gave up their lives in defense of their country, along with 340,000 civilian fatalities. This represented a loss of life for 4.3% of the entire French population.
That is, for a major industrialized power, 4% of your population is dead in 4 years. And that probably doesn't even include then, remember the Spanish flu hits right after that and wipes out another 2 or 3% of the world's population. So, I mean, that's massive. That's absolutely massive. Now, granted, they were defending their home. And so you can expect that France and Russia are going to have the highest casualties because they are literally defending their homeland, whereas other countries like Britain, for example, are not. Serbia was defending their homeland. So I get that. I really do.
But many, many more were wounded. 4,266,000 additional French soldiers were wounded or maimed by the war, representing a total casualty amount similar to Russia's, but from a much smaller population. In total, around 15% of France's population became a casualty during the First World War.
And then when you compare that to men of military age, that's a much higher percentage. I don't know what the number would be, but I bet it's probably more like 40 or 50%, something like that.
A horrible loss of life that wouldn't be fully recovered 20 years later at the start of the Second World War. Other Entente countries in order of wartime casualties include Romania, which also suffered terribly at 10.4% of their population becoming casualties, as well as Greece, Belgium, Portugal, Montenegro, and Japan, with only about 1,000 casualties during the entire war.
And it's funny that, I shouldn't say it's funny, it's interesting that Japan only suffered 1,000 casualties, which I understand because of how far away they were, but they got really offended by how little of a role they had in the post-war settlement, which, maybe they contributed in other ways, but 1,000? When you've got countries like Serbia giving up a fourth of their population, Russia and France and Britain giving up millions dead and wounded.
But now let's take a look at the other side, the Central Powers, which were led by Germany. Germany was fighting on two fronts for most of the war and also suffered cataclysmic losses. 2,037,000 of her soldiers died fighting in the west and the east, and 594,000 of her civilians died largely due to starvation caused by the Allied blockade of the country. Another 2.5 million German soldiers were wounded during the course of the war, amounting to 7.8% of Germany's population becoming a casualty.
So I will say this, and this is kind of interesting. If you think about the German casualties as compared to who they were fighting, it seems, at least on the surface, like they were inflicting far more casualties than they were taking. Now, I get that they weren't the only Central Power that was fighting, but it's mostly them and the Austro-Hungarians. And I'm guessing the Austro-Hungarians didn't suffer nearly as many casualties. I'll be interested to see what those numbers are. And then, of course, the Ottomans.
While Germany suffered the highest raw numbers of the Central Powers' casualties, she didn't suffer the highest percentage-wise. While Austria-Hungary took less casualties overall, they represented a higher proportion of that empire's population, 10.77%. Over 1.3 million soldiers were killed and another 3.6 million injured, all of which helps to explain why the Austro-Hungarian Empire itself wasn't able to survive the war. But the worst suffering on the Central Powers side occurred inside of the Ottoman Empire, and most of it was self-inflicted. The Ottomans joined the war in 1915 and suffered 548,000 military fatalities, and another 582,000 wounded fighting against mostly the British, French, and the Russians. But absurdly high civilian deaths inside of the Ottoman Empire were largely due to the Ottoman government's policy of ethnic cleansing against her Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian ethnic minorities. Collectively known as the Armenian Genocide, 1.5 million Armenians were systematically killed by the Ottoman government during and shortly after the war.
That does not get talked about nearly enough. That's 1.5 million Armenians. That it's not to the degree that the Jews were killed and others during World War II and the Holocaust, but it's 1.5 million people that were wiped out by their own government and by the government of occupation because of their ethnicity, because of their background and their heritage. It's no different than what was done to China by the Japanese, than what was done to various European powers by the Germans during World War II. And yet we don't talk about that a whole lot. The Armenian genocide was absolutely horrendous, what happened.
Along with 600,000 Greeks and 225,000 Assyrians. Accounting for all of this in addition to the military casualties, an enormous 17% of the Ottoman Empire's population was killed or wounded during the conflict, which can also help to explain why this empire too didn't survive long after the war was over. And finally, Bulgaria was another member of this alliance that suffered greatly as well, with 6.8% of their population becoming casualty victims of the Great War. In total, and across all countries, about 9 million soldiers lost their lives, as well as 7 million civilians. 36% of all deaths were Entente military, 22% were the Central Powers military, another 22% were Central Powers civilians, and the final 20% were Entente civilians. The First World War was, and still remains, the bloodiest war ever fought in the history of the United Kingdom, France, Italy, Belgium, Bulgaria, Romania, Serbia, Turkey, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada. The Second World War was actually not as bad for all of these mentioned countries, but it would be worse for others like Russia and Germany. Hopefully, after two terrible lessons during the 20th century, humanity will never forget what can happen when we let our differences get the better of us. Lessons of any kind are valuable for both societies and for individuals.
So yeah, let's plan on continuing this conversation. If you have something to add or an observation that you've made from this video, please use the comment section below and let's talk about that. I will definitely be visiting some of these military cemeteries on both sides of the conflict, German, as well as the Allies, the Entente. Very much looking forward to being able to visit places like the Musée American Cemetery, visiting some of the cemeteries in the Somme, Verdun, other areas, highlighting some of the soldiers there, talking about them a little more. If there's somewhere particular that you want to see, be thinking about that, because when I do get closer to some of these trips that I'm going to be taking, I will be posting about that to let you guys know, so I can get an idea of what it is that you want to see, so I can make sure that I cover as much of that as possible in creating some original content for you guys. In the coming weeks, I am going to be doing some more original content, both from at home but also out visiting sites, so be watching for those things. Don't forget to check out the links in the description below, especially the link to the original video here, so you can check that out for yourself. Hit that like button if you would, and we will see you again soon. Thanks for watching.